3 words changed everything. She's waking up. I wasn't supposed to survive that surgery. I wasn't supposed to hear what they'd done, but I did. And now they're about to learn why you should never underestimate a woman with nothing left to lose. If you're watching this, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The antiseptic smell hit me first, followed by the rhythmic beeping of machines that suggested I was still among the living. My eyelids felt like they'd been sealed with industrial strength glue, but I managed to pry them open to find myself staring at white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights. She's waking up, a nurse announced cheerfully, as if consciousness were some sort of personal achievement. Rebecca's face materialized above me, perfectly made up, despite what I assumed had been a medical emergency. My daughter's smile looked like it had been practiced in front of a mirror, warm enough to fool strangers. But I'd been her mother for 43 years. Behind her stood David, my son-in-law, checking what appeared to be a very expensive new watch. Funny how medical crises seemed to coincide with his accessory upgrades. "Mother, you're finally awake," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that theatrical concern I remembered from her high school drama productions. "We were so worried." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like I'd been gargling with gravel. The last thing I clearly remembered was dinner at my house, pot roast, if memory served, and then that sudden searing pain in my head that had dropped me like a sack of potatoes. "Don't strain yourself," David said, stepping closer with the kind of practiced bedside manner that probably worked well on elderly clients. "Everything's been taken care of while you were recovering." That phrase, "everything's been taken care of," had never, in my experience, preceded good news. "What do you mean?" I managed to croak. They exchanged one of those loaded glances that married couples perfect over time. "Well," Rebecca began with the delicate air of someone about to discuss an unpleasant but necessary topic, "given your condition and the doctor's recommendations about stress, we sold the beach house." David finished smoothly. For a moment, I wondered if the aneurysm had affected my hearing. "I'm sorry." "What?" "The Cape Cod property," David clarified, as if there might be confusion about which $3 million beachfront home we were discussing. "The sale went through yesterday. My sanctuary, my refuge, the house where I'd planned to spend whatever years remained to me, watching the ocean and reading books I'd never had time for during my academic career." "That's impossible," I whispered. "I never authorized any sale." David produced a manila folder from his briefcase with the flourish of a magician revealing his best trick. "Actually, you did right here." He pointed to a signature that bore some resemblance to my handwriting. "If you squinted and had consumed adequate alcohol." The doctor explained that memory issues are completely normal after this type of brain trauma, Rebecca added helpfully. "Short-term memory loss, confusion about recent events." I stared at the document, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I had absolutely no memory of signing anything related to my house. But then again, I also had no memory of the past week, so perhaps they had a point. "You're probably feeling disoriented," David continued with professional sympathy. "It's understandable. That's why we took care of this for you. The money from the sale will go toward your care," Rebecca explained. "We found a lovely facility in Illinois that specializes in post-stroke recovery." Illinois, 2,000 miles from the ocean. I loved from everything familiar. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Why Illinois?" "It's where we found the best care at the most reasonable cost," David replied. "Your medical expenses are going to be significant, and we want to make sure the money lasts." Something was beginning to crystallize in my mind. Not quite suspicion, but a growing awareness that this conversation was following a script I hadn't been given a copy of. "How long was I unconscious?" I asked. 6 days, Rebecca answered. "The surgery was very complicated. We weren't sure you'd." She let the sentence hang, but I caught the implication. They weren't sure I'd survive, and somehow during those 6 days when my life hung in the balance, they'd managed to sell my house. "The timing seems remarkably efficient," I observed. David's smile flickered slightly. "We didn't want to burden you with business details during your recovery. Sometimes family has to make difficult decisions." I closed my eyes, trying to process this information through the fog of medication and confusion. When I opened them again, Both Rebecca and David were watching me with expressions that might have been concern if you didn't look too closely. I think I need some time to rest, I said finally. Of course, Rebecca said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. We'll let you sleep. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold despite the warm hospital air. David's briefcase was monogrammed with his initials. But what caught my attention was the small logo underneath: Thornfield and Associates, Real Estate Law. My son-in-law wasn't just any lawyer, he specialized in real estate transactions, and apparently, he just completed a very significant one while I was unconscious. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I had the distinct feeling I was going to need every bit of the intelligence that had carried me through 30 years of university politics to figure out exactly what game was being played here, and whether I was the player or the prize. Sleep eluded me like a solution to a particularly vexing academic problem. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's monogrammed briefcase and that smooth signature that was supposed to be mine. By the time morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, I'd made a decision. If someone was playing games with my life, I was going to learn the rules. A new nurse appeared with my breakfast. A cheerful woman whose badge identified her as Eleanor Rodriguez, RN. She had the kind of competent, non-nonsense demeanor I'd always appreciated in both nurses and graduate students. Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. How are we feeling today? Like someone who's been informed her house was sold while she was unconscious, I replied. Which is either remarkably efficient family management or something considerably more problematic. Eleanor paused in her adjustment of my fore, her professional smile shifting to something more genuine. That does sound unusual. Real estate transactions typically require the actual presence of the property owner. One would think so. She busied herself with checking my vitals, but I caught her glancing at my chart with the kind of attention that suggested she was reading between the lines. After 25 years in academia, I'd learned to recognize intelligence when I saw it. Mrs. Wilson, she said quietly. In my experience, family members who handle major financial decisions for incapacitated relatives usually discuss those decisions with medical staff to ensure they align with treatment plans and recovery timelines. And did they discuss this with medical staff? Not that I'm aware of. Eleanor finished her checks and moved closer to my bed. I've been a nurse here for 15 years. I've seen situations where elderly patients' families make decisions that aren't necessarily in the patient's best interest. The delicate way she phrased this told me everything I needed to know about Eleanor's experience with family dynamics in medical crises. What would you advise someone in such a situation? I asked. I'd advise them to request copies of all documents to understand their legal rights and to seek independent counsel if anything seems questionable. She paused. I'd also suggest they might want to review their medical records to understand exactly what happened before their surgery. After Eleanor left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the events leading up to my collapse. The memories were frustratingly hazy, but certain details began to emerge, like photographs developing in a dark room. David had been visiting more frequently in recent weeks, always with some excuse, checking on my well-being, bringing me groceries, insisting on making me coffee. At the time, I'd attributed his attention to genuine concern, though it had struck me as slightly out of character for someone who'd previously shown little interest in his mother-in-law's daily routine. And I'd been feeling increasingly unwell, headaches, dizziness, confusion that I'd attributed to aging and winter weather. Now looking back, the timing seemed suspiciously coincidental with David's increased attentiveness. When Rebecca and David returned that afternoon, I was ready with questions. I've been thinking about the house sale, I began without preamble. I'd like to understand the timeline better. David settled into the visitor's chair with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex transactions to confused clients. Of course. What would you like to know? When exactly did I supposedly sign the papers? 3 days before your aneurysm, he replied smoothly. You called me, said you'd been thinking about downsizing, asked me to prepare the documents, and I signed them where? At your house. I brought them by. We reviewed everything together. You signed in my presence. The story was plausible, professionally presented, and felt completely wrong. Not because I couldn't imagine wanting to sell the house. At 72, I could see the logic in downsizing, but because every instinct I'd developed over decades of evaluating student excuses was telling me this explanation had been rehearsed. "I'm curious about something," I said. "You're a real estate attorney, but you've never mentioned that in all the years I've known you." A barely perceptible tension appeared around David's eyes. It didn't seem relevant to family conversations. "Except when your mother-in-law needed to sell her house during a medical emergency." "Margaret," Rebecca interjected. "David's expertise has been a blessing. Can you imagine trying to navigate this without someone who understands the legal complexities?" I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. Rebecca had always been beautiful, but there was something different about her appearance lately. New jewelry, expensive clothes, a general polish that suggested recent financial improvement. "You're right," I said finally. "It's fortunate that David was available to handle everything so efficiently." They relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my words as acceptance rather than the growing suspicion they actually represented. After they left, Eleanor returned with my evening medications. "How was your visit?" she asked. "Educational," I replied. "Tell me, Eleanor, in your professional experience, how common is it for people to make major life changes immediately before suffering serious medical emergencies?" Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "In my experience, Mrs. Wilson, coincidences in medical situations are often worth examining more closely." That night, as I lay listening to the sounds of the hospital around me, I made another decision. If David and Rebecca thought they were dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be managed with smooth explanations and concerned expressions, they were about to discover how wrong they were. 30 years of academic politics had taught me that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who smiled while they prepared to destroy you. Time to remind them that retirement hadn't made me stupid. The next morning brought Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurologist with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best graduate students. She reviewed my chart with the thoroughness of someone who actually read the fine print. "Mrs. Wilson, I want to discuss your medication history before the aneurysm. Can you walk me through what you were taking regularly?" "Blood pressure medication, lisinopril, I believe, a daily multivitamin, occasional ibuprofen for joint pain." I paused, trying to remember. "And recently, David, my son-in-law, had been bringing me some additional supplements. He said they might help with the fatigue I'd been experiencing." Dr. Chen made careful notes. "Do you remember what these supplements were?" "He said they were a combination of vitamins and minerals that came in unmarked capsules, which I thought was odd, but David explained that his doctor recommended a specific formulation from a compounding pharmacy." "And when did you start taking these?" "Perhaps 6 weeks ago. David was very insistent that they would help with my energy levels and blood pressure." Dr. Chen's pen stopped moving. "Your blood pressure has been well controlled for years according to your primary care records. What made you think you needed additional help?" That was an excellent question. David mentioned that my readings seemed elevated when he checked them during his visits. He'd brought a home monitor, said he wanted to make sure I was staying healthy, and you felt comfortable taking unmarked supplements based on these readings? When she put it that way, it sounded remarkably naive. David's a professional. I assumed he'd consulted with medical experts. Dr. Chen closed my chart and fixed me with a direct gaze. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm going to order some additional blood work. I want to check for any residual substances that might have contributed to your cardiovascular event. You think the supplements caused my aneurysm? I think it's worth investigating whether what you were taking was actually supplements." After Dr. Chen left, I found myself replaying every interaction with David over the past 2 months. His sudden interest in my health, the home blood pressure monitoring, the unmarked capsules he'd insisted would help me feel better. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I'd been feeling progressively worse since starting David's supplements, not better. The fatigue had increased. The confusion had worsened. By the week before my collapse, I'd been having trouble concentrating on simple tasks. Eleanor appeared for my afternoon medication round, and I decided to test a theory. "Eleanor, in your experience, what would happen if someone took too much blood pressure medication over an extended period? Dangerous hypertension, confusion, dizziness, potential cardiovascular complications." She paused in her preparation of my pills. Why do you ask? Academic curiosity. Eleanor studied my face with the expression of someone who'd heard that phrase before in much less academic contexts. Mrs. Wilson, if you're concerned about any medications you were taking before your admission, Dr. Chen has ordered comprehensive toxicology screening. We'll know within 48 hours if there's anything unusual in your system. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Catherine, my younger sister, stood in the doorway looking like an avenging angel in a Chanel suit. At 68, Catherine retained the sharp-eyed intensity that had made her one of Boston's most feared corporate attorneys before her retirement. Margaret, she said, embracing me carefully. I came as soon as I heard. I didn't know Rebecca had called you. She didn't. I heard about your situation through other channels. Catherine's tone suggested those channels had been legal rather than familial. I understand there have been some significant changes in your circumstances. You could say that. Catherine pulled out a legal pad with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years taking notes that could later be used to destroy opposing counsel. Tell me everything. I described the house sale, David's role as real estate attorney, the mysterious supplements, and my growing certainty that the signature on the sales documents wasn't mine. Catherine listened without interruption, making occasional notes that looked like they could be used to plan either a legal strategy or a military campaign. Margaret, she said when I finished, how long has it been since we discussed the arrangements we made after Thomas died? Thomas, my late husband, Rebecca's father. The arrangements. I felt something click into place in my memory. The trust, I said slowly. The irrevocable trust, Catherine confirmed, established 15 years ago, naming me as trustee with you having lifetime residency rights, but no power to sell or transfer the property. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the implications became clear. They can't sell what they don't own. Exactly. The house has been owned by the Catherine Wilson Trust since 2009. You couldn't sell it even if you wanted to because you're not the legal owner. I stared at my sister, feeling pieces of a very complex puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into a pattern that was both infuriating and oddly satisfying. So, their sale is completely invalid, fraudulent, actually, since David would have known from any proper title search that you don't hold clear ownership. Catherine smiled with the expression she'd once worn while explaining to opposing counsel exactly how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. It appears, she continued, that your son-in-law has involved himself in a real estate transaction that's not just unethical, but criminal. The door opened, and Eleanor entered with my evening medications. She took one look at Catherine's legal pad and my expression and immediately understood that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. Mrs. Wilson, she said quietly, Dr. Chen wanted me to let you know that your toxicology results will be available tomorrow morning. She'll be discussing them with you personally. After Eleanor left, Catherine leaned forward with the focused intensity of a predator who just spotted prey. Margaret, I think it's time we had a conversation with David about his real estate expertise, specifically about how he managed to sell property he had no legal right to transfer. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we give him an opportunity to explain his actions before we involve law enforcement. Catherine's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Unless, of course, he'd prefer to explain them to a grand jury. Dr. Chen arrived the next morning with the expression of someone who'd found exactly what she'd been looking for, even though she'd hoped to be wrong. She closed the door behind her and pulled up a chair beside my bed. Mrs. Wilson, your toxicology results show elevated levels of blood pressure medication in your system. Significantly elevated. How significantly? Levels that would typically require emergency medical intervention. Combined with your age and underlying health factors, this level of medication could easily trigger the type of cardiovascular event you experienced. I absorbed this information with the peculiar calm that comes from having your worst suspicions confirmed. So, David's supplements were actually my blood pressure medication in higher doses. That would be my professional assessment. Yes. What you thought were vitamins were likely your prescribed lisinopril in concentrated form, possibly combined with additional blood pressure medications. Catherine, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone hearing potential criminal evidence. Doctor, in your professional opinion, Could this have been accidental? Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. The levels we found would require deliberate, sustained administration of multiple medications over several weeks. This wasn't a simple medication error. It was attempted murder, I said flatly. I can't make that determination, Dr. Chen replied. But I can tell you that what happened to you was not natural and it was not accidental. After Dr. Chen left, Catherine and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what we just learned. We need to call the police, Catherine said finally. Not yet. I was thinking like a professor again, analyzing all variables before drawing conclusions. We need more information. David may have been slowly poisoning me, but we still don't understand why he thought he could sell a house he doesn't own. Maybe he didn't know about the trust. I shook my head. David's a real estate attorney. Checking title ownership is basic due diligence. He had to know the house wasn't mine to sell. Then what was his plan? Before I could answer, the door opened and Rebecca entered with her usual perfectly coordinated outfit and concerned daughter expression. Today, however, I noticed details I'd previously overlooked. The expensive handbag, the jewelry that definitely hadn't come from a department store, the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone who'd recently had access to significant money. Mother, how are you feeling today? Much clearer. Thank you. In fact, Catherine and I have been discussing some very interesting legal questions about property ownership. Rebecca's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. Oh, yes. It seems there's been some confusion about the house sale. Catherine was just explaining that the property isn't actually mine to sell. The color drained from Rebecca's face like water from a broken pipe. What do you mean? Catherine spoke with the crisp precision of someone delivering particularly devastating news in a board meeting. I mean, the house has been held in an irrevocable trust for 15 years. Margaret has lifetime residency rights, but I'm the trustee with sole authority over any sale or transfer. Rebecca sat down heavily in the visitor's chair. That's impossible. Dad never mentioned any trust. Your father didn't know about it, I explained gently. I established it after discovering his affair to protect the property from being transferred to his secretary in his will. But David said he showed me the paperwork. The sale went through. The sale of what exactly? Catherine asked. You can't sell property you don't own, Rebecca. Any buyer would discover the title problem the moment they tried to close. Rebecca's hands began shaking. David said he had everything handled. He said the legal work was all proper. I watched my daughter's growing panic with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Rebecca, where exactly did David say the money from this sale went into escrow, waiting for the final paperwork? She trailed off as the implications became clear. What final paperwork? Catherine pressed. David said there were some technical issues with the title that would take a few weeks to resolve, but the buyer had already transferred funds to show good faith. Catherine and I exchanged glances. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was considerably more complex than simple real estate fraud. Rebecca, I said carefully, have you seen any of this money? My daughter's guilty expression told me everything I needed to know. How much have you spent? Catherine asked bluntly. It wasn't spending exactly. David said we needed to make some investments to protect the funds during the title resolution process. What kind of investments? A boat, some jewelry. David said we needed to diversify the assets. Rebecca's voice grew smaller with each word. I leaned back against my pillows, beginning to understand the full scope of what David had accomplished. He'd convinced a buyer to transfer money for a house he couldn't legally sell, used that money to purchase assets in his and Rebecca's names, and somehow persuaded my daughter that this was legitimate financial planning. It was audacious, illegal, and remarkably stupid for someone who supposedly understood real estate law. Rebecca, I said gently, I think we need to have a very serious conversation with David about his investment strategy. My daughter looked at me with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been swimming with sharks. Mother, I think we might be in serious trouble. Yes, dear, I replied with what I hoped was reassuring calm. You are. But as I watched Rebecca's growing comprehension of her situation, I realized something interesting was happening. For the first time in years, My daughter was looking at me not as a burden to be managed, but as someone who might be able to help her. It was progress of a sort. David arrived that evening with flowers and the kind of aggressively cheerful demeanor that immediately put me on guard. Rebecca had clearly briefed him about our afternoon conversation because his usual smooth confidence had developed some interesting cracks around the edges. "Margaret, you're looking much better today," he said, arranging the flowers with unnecessary attention to detail. "Rebecca mentioned you had some questions about the property transfer." "A few." "Yes." I gestured to the chair beside my bed. Catherine was explaining some technical aspects of real estate law that I found fascinating. David's eyes flicked to Catherine, clearly recognizing her as a potential threat, but unsure how significant. "Well, real estate transactions can be complex. It's understandable that some aspects might be confusing." "Oh, I'm not confused about the technical aspects," I assured him. "I'm confused about how you managed to sell a house I don't legally own." The flowers nearly fell as David's hands went still. "I'm sorry." Catherine opened her briefcase with the theatrical precision of someone who'd spent decades making opposing counsel nervous. "The property in question has been held in an irrevocable trust since 2009. Mrs. Wilson has no legal authority to sell, transfer, or encumber the property in any way." David's lawyer training kicked in, and his expression shifted to professional neutrality. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. My title search showed clear ownership." "Then perhaps you could show us this title search," Catherine suggested sweetly, along with the purchase agreement, the closing documents, and the disbursement records for the sale proceeds. "Those documents are confidential attorney work product," David replied. "Not when they involve my client's property," Catherine interrupted, "or when they may constitute evidence of real estate fraud." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. David looked between Catherine and me, clearly recalculating whatever strategy he'd planned for this conversation. "Margaret," he said, focusing on me with what he probably thought was persuasive sincerity, "I think there's been a serious miscommunication. If there are any title issues, we can certainly resolve them." "David," I interrupted gently, "I think it's time we discussed your supplement recommendations." He went very still. "My what?" "The vitamins you've been bringing me." Dr. Chen found them quite interesting from a pharmaceutical perspective. Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke up. "What about the vitamins?" "It turns out they weren't vitamins," I explained. "They were concentrated doses of blood pressure medication, enough to cause exactly the type of cardiovascular emergency that brought me here." The silence that followed was profound. David's face had gone completely white while Rebecca stared at him with growing horror. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. "David, you said they were supplements." "They were supplements," David said quickly. Margaret must be confused about what she was taking. "The toxicology report was quite specific," Catherine interjected. "Would you like me to read the relevant sections?" David stood abruptly, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. Margaret, you've been under tremendous stress, and after a brain injury, memory can be unreliable. Are you suggesting I imagine taking the pills you brought me?" I asked with genuine curiosity. "I'm suggesting that traumatic brain injuries can affect perception and memory in ways that make patients unreliable witnesses to their own experiences. It was a clever legal strategy. Question the victim's competence to remember events." Unfortunately for David, he was dealing with someone who'd spent 30 years listening to creative excuses from graduate students. "David," I said with the patient tone I'd once used for particularly slow learners, "you're a real estate attorney who attempted to sell property you knew you didn't have clear title to using forged documents while systematically poisoning the supposed seller to ensure she couldn't interfere with your scheme. That's not to mention you then convinced my daughter to help you spend money that came from defrauding a legitimate buyer, probably telling her it was all perfectly legal." Rebecca made a small sound that might have been a sob. "The only question I have," I continued, "is whether you actually thought you could get away with this, or whether you're simply not as intelligent as your law degree suggests." David's face had progressed from white to an interesting shade of purple. "You can't prove any of this." "Actually," Elelena said from the doorway, "we can. We all turned to find Eleanor standing there with what appeared to be a small recording device. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state for recordings, she explained helpfully, and hospital policy requires documentation of suspected elder abuse situations. David looked around the room like a trapped animal seeking an escape route. This is entrapment. This is evidence, Catherine corrected, of attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and probably several other felonies we haven't thought of yet. I want a lawyer, David said. An excellent idea, I agreed. You're going to need a very good one. As Eleanor called security and Catherine began making notes about criminal referrals, I looked at Rebecca, who was staring at David with the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse. Rebecca, I said gently, I think it's time you and I had a private conversation about exactly how much you knew about David's business practices. My daughter's tear-filled eyes met mine, and for the first time in years, I saw something I recognized. Not the calculating adult who'd been managing my life, but the scared child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Mom, she whispered. I think I've made some terrible mistakes. Yes, dear, I said softly. I think you have. The next morning brought Detective Sarah Morgan, a compact woman with intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen enough family dysfunction to find very little shocking. Eleanor had called the police after our recorded conversation with David, and Detective Morgan had spent the night reviewing what she described as one of the more creative elder abuse cases she'd encountered. Mrs. Wilson, she began, settling into the visitor's chair with a notepad. I need to understand the timeline of events leading up to your hospitalization. I walked her through David's increased attention over the past 2 months, the mysterious supplements, my deteriorating health, and the conveniently timed house sale. Detective Morgan took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or specific incidents. And your daughter, she said, glancing at Rebecca, who sat in the corner looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. What was her role in these events? Rebecca looked at me pleadingly before speaking. I thought David was helping Mom with her finances. He said she was getting confused about her medications, that she'd asked him to handle the house sale, but you benefited from the supposed sale proceeds, Detective Morgan observed. David said we needed to invest the money while the title issues were being resolved. He made it sound like standard financial planning. I watched my daughter struggle to explain her actions and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, maternal protectiveness. Rebecca had been naive and greedy, but she'd been manipulated by someone who understood exactly how to exploit her weaknesses. Detective, I said, I think it's important to understand that David is a professional who specializes in exactly this type of transaction. He knew how to make illegal activities sound legitimate to someone without legal training. Detective Morgan studied my face. Are you suggesting your daughter was unaware of the fraudulent nature of these activities? I'm suggesting that my daughter was lied to by someone she trusted, just as I was. After Detective Morgan left to arrest David, Rebecca and I found ourselves alone for the first time since this entire situation began. She sat beside my bed, tears streaming down her face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have questioned what David was doing. I should have protected you instead of what, Rebecca? Instead of being relieved that someone else was handling your affairs so I didn't have to. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. I've been a terrible daughter. I considered this admission carefully. You've been a distant daughter and perhaps a selfish one, but David is the one who tried to kill me. But I went along with everything. I spent the money. I believed him when he said you were getting confused and needed management. Rebecca, I said firmly. Did you know David was poisoning me? Of course not. Did you know the house sale was fraudulent? No, I thought David showed me all the paperwork. Then you were a victim, too. A willing victim who benefited from the crime, but a victim nonetheless. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the wreckage of our family relationships. What happens now? Rebecca asked finally. Now you help the police build their case against David. You return whatever stolen money you can recover. You testify truthfully about what he told you and when. And then I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Beneath the expensive clothes and defensive attitude, Rebecca looked exhausted, not just tired, but worn down in a way that suggested this hadn't been the first time David had manipulated her into questionable decisions. Then we figure out how to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty instead of convenience. Rebecca's eyes filled with fresh tears. Do you think that's possible after everything I've done? Rebecca, do you love me? The question seemed to surprise her. Of course I do. Do you want me to be safe and happy? Yes. Then yes, I think it's possible. It won't be easy and it won't happen quickly, but I think we can find our way back to being a family. That afternoon, Catherine returned with James Harrington, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in complex fraud cases. James had the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of my best graduate students, combined with the predatory focus of someone who enjoyed destroying criminals who targeted vulnerable populations. Mrs. Wilson, he said after reviewing the case materials, you've given us enough evidence to prosecute David for attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and probably money laundering. He's looking at significant prison time. What about Rebecca? James glanced at my daughter, who had remained silent throughout his explanation. That depends on several factors: her cooperation with the investigation, the extent of her knowledge about the fraudulent activities, her willingness to make restitution. I want to cooperate, Rebecca said quickly. I want to help however I can. Good, James replied. Because we're going to need detailed information about every transaction, every conversation, every document David showed you. This case is going to be about establishing a pattern of systematic manipulation and abuse. As James outlined the legal process ahead of us, I realized something unexpected was happening. For the first time in years, Rebecca and I were on the same side of something important. She was no longer the daughter trying to manage my life, and I was no longer the mother being managed. We were two women who'd been deceived by the same man, working together to ensure he faced consequences for his actions. It wasn't the family reconciliation I might have imagined, but it was a beginning. 3 weeks later, I sat in my living room overlooking the Atlantic, breathing salt air that tasted like freedom and vindication. The house felt different now. Not just mine, but definitively, legally, unquestionably mine. Catherine had handled the paperwork to invalidate David's fraudulent sale, and the confused buyers had been surprisingly understanding once they learned they'd been victims of a con man. Rebecca had moved back to her apartment but visited daily, helping me recover both physically and emotionally from what the media had begun calling the Thornfield real estate fraud. It was a terrible name, but at least it was accurate. The prosecutor called, Rebecca announced, entering with coffee and the newspapers. David's lawyer wants to discuss a plea bargain. What kind of plea? 15 years in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. Rebecca sat down my coffee with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to notice details she'd previously ignored. James thinks we should consider it. I sipped my coffee, real coffee, properly brewed with no pharmaceutical additions, and watched seagulls wheel over the waves. What do you think? I think 15 years is a long time, but not long enough. Rebecca's voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. He tried to kill you, Mom. He manipulated both of us. He stole from innocent buyers who just wanted a beach house. The transformation in my daughter over the past month had been remarkable. Gone was the superficial woman who'd been content to let others handle difficult decisions. In her place was someone who asked hard questions, demanded honest answers, and took responsibility for her mistakes. The restitution would cover everything, Rebecca continued. The boat, the jewelry, all the money that went through our accounts. I've already given the lawyer documentation for everything I can remember purchasing. And how do you feel about giving up all those things? Rebecca looked genuinely surprised by the question, relieved. Honestly, I always knew something was wrong. Even when I was trying to convince myself it wasn't. Expensive things that come from hurting people don't feel like gifts. They feel like evidence. Catherine arrived mid-morning with James and an armload of legal documents. She'd been staying in town since my hospitalization, claiming she needed to oversee my recovery, but really providing the steady support I'd been missing for years. The DA's office is prepared to recommend the plea agreement, James announced, spreading papers across my coffee table. David's cooperation could help them prosecute other real estate fraud cases throughout the state. Other cases? I asked. Apparently, David's been running variations of this scheme for several years, targeting elderly property owners, manipulating family members, using his legal expertise to legitimize fraudulent transactions. Rebecca went pale. How many others? At least 6 that they've identified so far. Elderly clients who signed over property rights they didn't understand. Family members who were convinced they were helping with necessary legal work. I absorbed this information with a mixture of satisfaction and anger. David hadn't just targeted me. He'd built a career on exploiting vulnerable people. Were any of the other victims harmed physically? 2 were hospitalized for medication-related complications. 1 died from what was initially classified as natural causes, but is now being reinvestigated. The room fell silent as we processed the implications. David hadn't just been a con man. He'd been a serial predator whose schemes had escalated to deadly levels. I want him to accept the plea, I said finally. Mom, Rebecca began, 15 years isn't. 15 years is 15 years more than his victims thought they'd live to see justice served, I interrupted. And his cooperation might prevent other families from going through what we've experienced. James nodded approvingly. The plea also includes a lifetime prohibition from practicing law and mandatory financial monitoring for 10 years after his release. What about the civil suits? Catherine asked. The victims' families are already filing. David's going to spend whatever freedom he eventually gets fighting lawsuits and paying restitution. After the lawyers left, Rebecca and I sat on the deck, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. It had become our daily ritual, a quiet hour when we talked about recovery, both medical and emotional. Can I ask you something? Rebecca said eventually. Anything. When did you know that David was lying about everything? I considered the question carefully. I think some part of me always knew something was wrong, but I wanted to believe that my daughter and son-in-law cared about my well-being. It was easier than accepting that I'd become an obstacle to be managed. I did care about your well-being, Rebecca said quietly. I just didn't want to be responsible for it. David made it seem like there was an easy solution that would help everyone. And now, I understand that easy solutions to complex problems are usually just well-disguised disasters. As darkness fell over the Atlantic, I realized something profound had happened over the past month. The family that had betrayed me was gone. But a new family had emerged from the wreckage, honest rather than convenient, chosen rather than inherited, based on respect rather than obligation. Rebecca, I said as we prepared to go inside, I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled these past few weeks. Even though I helped him steal from you, especially because when you realized what had happened, you chose to make it right instead of making excuses. My daughter smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in months. I learned from an excellent teacher, my mother, who taught me that intelligence without integrity is just sophisticated selfishness. I laughed, recognizing my own words from a lecture I'd given years ago to a graduate ethics class. I can't believe you remembered that. I remember everything you taught me, Mom. I just forgot to apply it when it mattered most. As we headed inside, I felt something settle that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. The threat was neutralized. The family was healing. The house was truly mine. Some investments in justice yield returns you never anticipated. 6 months after David's arrest, I sat in a courtroom watching my former son-in-law accept his plea agreement with the resignation of someone who'd finally run out of clever strategies. He'd aged considerably during his time in custody. The expensive suits and confident demeanor were replaced by an orange jumpsuit and the defeated posture of someone facing the consequences of a lifetime of bad choices. Mr. Thornfield, Judge Patricia Morrison said, reviewing the plea documents. You understand that by accepting this agreement, you're admitting to attempted murder, real estate fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges across multiple cases? Yes, Your Honor, David replied, his voice barely audible. And you understand that you'll serve a minimum of 12 years before being eligible for parole with a lifetime prohibition from practicing law? Yes, Your Honor. Rebecca sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She'd insisted on attending the hearing, saying she needed to see this chapter of our lives officially closed. I'd offered to go alone, but she'd pointed out that we were both victims of David's schemes and should witness his accountability together. The prosecutor outlined David's crimes in methodical detail: the systematic poisoning, the fraudulent property transfers, the manipulation of family members, the theft from innocent buyers. As the full scope of his crimes was revealed, I found myself feeling not anger, but a kind of academic fascination with the elaborate nature of his deceptions. "Your Honor," David's attorney said when given the opportunity to speak, "my client recognizes the severity of his actions and the harm he's caused to multiple families. He's prepared to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations and to make complete financial restitution to all victims." Judge Morrison looked down at David with the expression of someone who'd seen enough criminal creativity to find very little impressive about elaborate fraud schemes. "Mr. Thornfield, the court finds your crimes particularly reprehensible because they targeted elderly victims who trusted you with their welfare and safety. You exploited that trust to steal their property and, in some cases, to threaten their lives." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The court accepts your plea agreement. You are sentenced to 15 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 12 years, contingent on full restitution and continued cooperation with law enforcement." As they led David away, he looked back once at Rebecca and me. I saw something in his expression that might have been remorse, though it was difficult to distinguish from simple regret at being caught. Rebecca squeezed my arm as we watched him disappear through the courthouse doors. "How do you feel?" she asked as we made our way outside. "Like a very long, very complicated story has finally reached its proper conclusion." That evening, we gathered at my house for what had become our weekly family dinner. Catherine and Eleanor were discussing plans for a European trip they'd been planning since Eleanor's retirement from the hospital. James was reviewing documents for another elder fraud case he'd taken on, inspired by our experience to specialize in protecting vulnerable seniors. The restitution checks should be distributed next week. James announced the buyers who were defrauded will get their money back plus damages. The other victims' families will receive compensation for their losses. "What about the property David used as collateral for his schemes?" Catherine asked. "All being liquidated. The boat, the vacation home he bought with stolen funds, even his law office equipment. Everything goes to victim compensation." I found myself thinking about poetic justice. How David's assets were being redistributed to the people he'd harmed. How his career, built on exploitation, was funding recovery for his victims. "There's something else," Rebecca said, looking nervous. "I've been offered a position with the State Attorney General's office, working on elder protection cases." The room fell silent as everyone processed this announcement. "It would mean using my experience to help investigate other cases like ours," she continued, "helping families recognize the warning signs, working with prosecutors to build stronger cases against predators who target seniors." I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd emerged from the wreckage of her marriage and her poor choices with a clear sense of purpose and responsibility. "What do you think about this opportunity?" I asked. "I think it's a chance to turn the worst experience of my life into something that might prevent other families from going through what we did." Eleanor raised her wine glass to Rebecca for choosing to be part of the solution. We toasted my daughter's new direction, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: unqualified pride in the woman Rebecca was becoming. Later, as the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Rebecca and I stood on the deck, watching the moonlight dance across the Atlantic. "Mom," she said quietly, "I know I can't undo what happened. The choices I made. The way I let David manipulate both of us." "Rebecca," I interrupted gently, "you've spent the past 6 months proving that people can change when they decide to take responsibility for their actions. I'm more proud of who you're becoming than disappointed in who you were. Do you really think I can help other families? I think you have something most advocates don't have: first-hand experience with how sophisticated these scams can be and how easy it is for loving families to be deceived by professionals who understand exactly how to exploit trust." My daughter smiled with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from finding purpose in painful experience. "Besides," I added with a grin, "you learned from an excellent teacher in how to be suspicious of people who offer easy solutions to complex problems." "Who was that?" You actually watching you learn to question everything David told you taught me to trust my own instincts again. As we headed inside, I realized that the best revenge really was living well. David was beginning a lengthy prison sentence while Rebecca was starting a career dedicated to protecting vulnerable people. Some lessons are expensive, but the education is worth every penny. 1 year after David's sentencing, I stood at a podium in the Boston Convention Center looking out at an audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, and family advocates gathered for the annual Elder Protection Symposium. At 73, I'd never imagined I'd become a public speaker, but surviving attempted murder apparently qualified me as an expert in recognizing family-based financial abuse. 2 years ago, I began as a retired professor living quietly in my beach house, trusting my family to have my best interests at heart. I learned the hard way that predators often come disguised as helpful relatives, and that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in concern for our well-being. I walked them through the warning signs I'd missed, the increased attention from David, the mysterious health supplements, the urgent need to handle my affairs for my own good. The audience took notes with the focused attention of people who understood they were hearing information that could save lives. The key lesson, I continued, is that authentic care respects autonomy. When someone insists on making decisions for you because they know what's best, they're not protecting you. They're controlling you. The difference is whether you retain the right to say no. During the Q&A, a woman in her 60s raised her hand. Mrs. Wilson, how do you rebuild trust after discovering that your own family was willing to harm you for financial gain? It was a question I'd been asking myself for the past year. You don't rebuild the same trust, I replied honestly. You build a different kind of trust, one based on consistent actions over time rather than assumptions about family loyalty. Trust becomes something that's earned through behavior, not inherited through genetics. After the presentation, Rebecca joined me for lunch. She'd driven down from her new job in Springfield, where she was working with a task force investigating elder fraud across western Massachusetts. The work suited her. It required the analytical skills she'd always possessed, but directed them toward protecting people rather than managing them. You were brilliant up there, she said as we settled into a quiet corner table. I was taking notes like I'd never heard your story before. How are things going with the task force? Challenging, but rewarding. We've identified 3 major fraud rings operating in the region, and yesterday we got warrants to search several suspect law offices. Rebecca's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found work that mattered. It's amazing how many David Thornfields are out there using legal expertise to legitimize theft. Any cases similar to ours? Too many. Elderly homeowners signing over property rights they don't understand. Family members who convince themselves they're helping by going along with questionable legal advice. Professionals who exploit the trust that comes with their credentials. I studied my daughter's face, noting the confidence that had replaced the defensive uncertainty she'd carried for years. Do you ever regret not pursuing this kind of work earlier in your life? Sometimes, but I don't think I could have done this work effectively without understanding how easy it is to be manipulated by someone you trust. My experience with David makes me better at recognizing the warning signs other families miss. That afternoon, we drove to my house together, continuing a tradition we'd developed of spending weekends working in my garden and talking about everything we'd never discussed when our relationship was built on convenience rather than choice. I have some news, Rebecca said as we planted bulbs that would bloom in the spring. I've been asked to testify before a state legislative committee about strengthening penalties for family-based financial crimes. That's wonderful. What are you recommending? Mandatory reporting requirements for professionals who become aware of suspicious financial transactions involving elderly clients. Enhanced penalties when the perpetrator is a family member or caregiver. Streamline processes for victims to recover stolen assets. I paused in my planting, struck by the transformation in my daughter's priorities. A year ago, Rebecca had been focused on managing my life to minimize her own responsibilities. Now she was working to protect other elderly people from the kind of manipulation she'd once facilitated. I'm proud of you, I said simply. For what? For choosing to become part of the solution rather than just apologizing for having been part of the problem. That evening, As we sat on the deck watching the sunset, Eleanor and Catherine joined us for dinner. Eleanor had moved in permanently 6 months earlier, claiming she needed a change of scenery, but really providing the companionship I'd been missing without realizing it. Catherine visited every few weeks, having relocated from Arizona to be closer to family. "I have an announcement," Eleanor said as we settled in with wine and Catherine's famous lasagna. "Margaret and I have been discussing a project." "What kind of project?" Rebecca asked. "A book," I explained. Combining my experience as a victim with Eleanor's professional knowledge about recognizing abuse in medical settings. A practical guide for families and healthcare providers. The working title is Surviving Family, a guide to recognizing and preventing elder exploitation, Eleanor added. "We want to create something that helps people identify warning signs before they become victims." Catherine raised her wine glass to productive uses of painful experience. As we toasted the book project, I realized something had crystallized over the past year. What had begun as a survival story had evolved into something larger, a mission to ensure that other families didn't have to learn these lessons through betrayal and near-death experiences. "You know what the best part is?" Rebecca said as evening settled around us. "David thought he was destroying our family. Instead, he accidentally created a family that's stronger and more honest than anything we had before." I looked around the table at these women who'd become my chosen family. Catherine, who'd provided legal expertise and sisterly support. Eleanor, who'd recognized abuse and become a protector. Rebecca, who'd transformed guilt into purpose. "Some mistakes," I said thoughtfully, "turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to everyone except the person who made them." David was serving his time in a state prison, cut off from the family he'd tried to exploit. Meanwhile, we were building something he'd never understand, a family based on choice rather than obligation, on honesty rather than convenience, on respect rather than control. The revenge was sweeter than anything I could have planned. 2 years after David's conviction, I received a letter that made me pause over my morning coffee. The return address indicated it came from MCI Norfolk, and the handwriting was unmistakably David's. I set it aside unopened and went about my day, tending my garden, working on the book Eleanor and I were writing, preparing for Rebecca's weekend visit. The letter sat on my kitchen counter like an unexploded bomb, ignored but not forgotten. "Are you going to read it?" Eleanor asked that evening as we prepared dinner. "I'm debating whether there's anything David could say that would be worth the mental energy required to process it. Curiosity is a dangerous thing." I laughed, thinking of how curiosity had served me well in both my academic career and my recent adventures in criminal justice. "Yes, but it's also been remarkably useful." Rebecca arrived the next morning and immediately noticed the letter. "Is that from David?" "Apparently. Have you read it?" "Not yet. I'm trying to decide if I care about his perspective on current events." Rebecca considered this while unpacking groceries for our weekend cooking project. "I think I'd want to know what he had to say. Not because his opinion matters, but because I'd be curious about his mental state and academic interest in the criminal mind." Something like that. That afternoon, we sat on the deck with Catherine and Eleanor, the letter still unopened between us, like a particularly uninviting puzzle. "You could always read it and summarize," Catherine suggested, "filter out any manipulation or self-pity and just report the factual content. Or," Eleanor added, "you could decide that some conversations aren't worth having, even one-sided ones." I picked up the envelope, studying David's handwriting. It looked shakier than I remembered, less confident. Prison had apparently affected his penmanship along with his legal career. "I think," I said finally, "that I'm going to read it, not because I care about David's feelings, but because I'm curious about what he thinks he can accomplish with a letter after failing so spectacularly with everything else." I opened the envelope and unfolded 2 pages of careful handwriting. "Margaret," the letter began. "I know you have no reason to read this and even less reason to believe anything I say, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you and Rebecca. Prison has given me a lot of time to think about my choices and their consequences. I want to be clear that this is not an attempt to minimize my crimes or seek forgiveness I don't deserve. I tried to kill you for money. I manipulated Rebecca into helping me steal from you. I deceived innocent buyers and used my legal training to legitimize fraud. There are no excuses for these actions. What I want you to know is that the investigation into my activities has helped prosecute 17 other cases of elder fraud across 3 states. My cooperation has led to convictions that recovered over $2 million for victims' families. It doesn't undo the harm I caused, but it has prevented harm to others. I also want you to know that Rebecca visits occasionally. She doesn't come to forgive me or to maintain any kind of relationship. She comes to interview me about my methods and motivations for her work with the state task force. She's become remarkably skilled at getting information that helps protect other families. I'm proud of her, if I'm allowed to say that. She's turned her experience into expertise that matters. She's stronger and more purposeful than she ever was when she was married to me. I know this letter might seem self-serving, but I wanted you to understand that your survival and your decision to fight back has had consequences beyond just my imprisonment. The publicity around our case has led to legislative changes, improved training for healthcare providers, and enhanced protection for vulnerable seniors. You've become an advocate whose work saves lives. Rebecca has found a career that uses her experience to help others. Even my imprisonment has value if it prevents other families from experiencing what ours did. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve peace of mind. But I wanted you to know that the ripple effects of your courage continue to protect people I'll never meet. Respectfully, David. I read the letter twice, then passed it to Rebecca, who shared it with Catherine and Eleanor. We sat in silence for several minutes, processing this unexpected communication from the man who'd nearly destroyed our family. Well, Catherine said finally, that's not what I expected. What did you expect? Eleanor asked. Self-pity, manipulation, attempts to minimize his crimes. This is actually thoughtful. Rebecca looked up from rereading the letter. He's right about the ripple effects. The task force has used our case as a model for training programs across the state. We've prevented dozens of similar schemes, and the book is being used by hospitals and senior centers nationwide, Eleanor added. I considered David's words about consequences beyond punishment. I suppose even terrible people can occasionally produce useful insights. Are you going to respond? Rebecca asked. I don't think so. There's nothing I need to say to David and nothing he needs to hear from me. But I'm glad he wrote it. Why? Because it confirms that he understands the full scope of what he did. That's important for his rehabilitation, even if I don't care about his rehabilitation. That evening, as we prepared dinner, Rebecca brought up something that had apparently been on her mind. Mom, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest, always. Do you think David's letter was genuine, or was it just another manipulation? I considered the question while chopping vegetables for our salad. I think it was both. David is manipulative by nature. It's how he thinks and communicates. But I also think prison has forced him to confront the reality of his actions in ways he'd previously avoided. So you believe he's genuinely remorseful? I believe he's genuinely aware of the consequences of his actions. Whether that constitutes remorse is a philosophical question I'm not qualified to answer. Rebecca smiled with the kind of analytical satisfaction she'd inherited from me. That's a very professorial response. I'm a very professorial person. It served me well in distinguishing between facts and feelings when evaluating complex situations. As we sat down to dinner, I realized something important had happened. David's letter hadn't reopened old wounds or created new emotional complications. It had simply provided information that confirmed what I already knew, that surviving his attempt to destroy me had led to protecting others from similar destruction. The mathematics of justice weren't always simple, but sometimes they were profoundly satisfying. 3 years after David's sentencing, I sat in my car outside MCI Norfolk, questioning the wisdom of my decision to accept his request for a visit. Rebecca had offered to come with me, but this felt like something I needed to do alone. Not for David's sake, but for my own sense of completion. The visiting room was designed to be as depressing as possible while still meeting basic human dignity requirements. David sat at a metal table wearing prison clothing that made him look smaller and older than I remembered. 3 years of incarceration had stripped away the confident professional veneer, revealing something more fundamentally human underneath. "Margaret," he said as I sat across from him. "Thank you for coming. I'm not here for your comfort, David. I'm here because I had some questions I wanted answered." "Of course, whatever you want to know." I studied his face, noting the genuine changes that imprisonment had wrought. Gone was the smooth charm that had once made him so convincing. In its place was something that looked like actual honesty. "I want to understand how you convinced yourself that slowly killing me was an acceptable solution to your problems." David was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I never thought of it as killing you. I told myself I was just making you sick enough to need help with your affairs. It wasn't until you nearly died that I understood what I was actually doing. And when you realized you were committing attempted murder, I panicked. The whole scheme was falling apart. The title issues with the house, the buyers asking questions, Rebecca starting to suspect something was wrong. I thought if you died from natural causes, all the problems would disappear." The casual way he discussed planning my death was chilling, but also informative. "What made you think you could get away with such an elaborate fraud?" "Arrogance, mostly. I'd been running smaller versions of this scheme for years without getting caught. Elderly clients who signed documents they didn't understand. Family members who went along with questionable legal advice because they trusted my expertise." "How many other victims were there?" 14. Over the course of 8 years, mostly elderly homeowners who needed legal help with property transfers. I'd manipulate them into signing over more authority than they intended, then use that authority to benefit myself or my associates. I absorbed this information with the detached fascination of someone studying a particularly interesting case study. And their families never suspected. Some did, but I was careful to target people whose families were already struggling with communication issues or financial stress. It's easier to convince someone that legal complexity requires professional management when they're already feeling overwhelmed. "What about Rebecca? How did you manipulate her into participating?" David's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine remorse. "Rebecca was lonely and insecure about her social status. I convinced her that your house sale was legitimate financial planning, then made her feel sophisticated for understanding complex investment strategies that were actually just money laundering." "Did she know about the poisoning?" "No. I told her you were having medication compliance issues and that I was helping you organize your pills. She believed me because she wanted to believe that someone else was handling your problems." I sat back, processing this confirmation of what I'd suspected. Rebecca had been naive and selfish, but she hadn't been a willing participant in attempted murder. "Why are you telling me all this now?" I asked. "Because Rebecca asked me to." She said understanding my methods would help her work with other families who've been victimized by similar schemes. "And you're helping her. Why?" "Because it's the only useful thing I can do with the knowledge I have. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can help prevent similar harm to others." We talked for another hour, with David providing detailed information about his methods and motivations that would be valuable for Rebecca's work with the task force. As our visit neared its end, I found myself with one final question. "Do you understand why I'm not forgiving you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "You don't forgive someone for attempting murder. You survive them. You stop them. And you move on with your life. Forgiveness is for mistakes, not for calculated attempts to kill family members for money." I looked at this man who'd nearly succeeded in erasing me from my own life and felt something settle that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. Not forgiveness, but a kind of closure that came from understanding the full scope of what I'd survived. "David," I said as I prepared to leave, "I hope prison has taught you something about the value of other people's lives." "It has. Too late to matter for my victims, but maybe not too late to matter for potential future victims." I left the prison feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd forgiven David. Forgiveness was neither required nor deserved, but because I'd confirmed that surviving his attack had led to protecting others from similar predators. That evening, I called Rebecca to share the information David had provided about his methods and victims. She listened with the professional attention of someone building a comprehensive understanding of how family-based fraud operated. How do you feel about seeing him? She asked when I finished my report. Like I've read the final chapter of a book I'd been trying to finish for 3 years. I understand what happened, why it happened, and what we've built from the wreckage. And David is serving his sentence and providing useful information about criminal methods. That's sufficient justice for someone who tried to kill me for money. Do you think he's genuinely changed? I considered this question while watching the ocean from my deck. I think prison has forced him to confront the reality of his actions in ways he'd previously avoided. Whether that constitutes genuine change is less important than whether it produces useful cooperation with law enforcement. Very practical. I'm a very practical person. It served me well in distinguishing between justice and revenge. As I hung up, I realized that my visit to David had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It had confirmed that the best revenge really was living well and using the experience of surviving his attack to build something stronger and more protective than what had existed before. David would spend the next decade in prison, while I would spend it working to ensure that other families didn't have to learn about predators the hard way. Some conversations are worth having once for the clarity they provide about choices made and consequences faced. This had been one of them. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.